Bulvanaka, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Stylish. I'm your host, Faz. This week, we discuss belonging and identity, words that are at the back of everybody's mind and on the tip of everybody's tongue, but also things that we don't very often discuss. This week, we get to speak to old friends and new acquaintances about what belonging means to them. I look forward to sharing their stories with you. On a recent trip to Nandi for a photo shoot, I had the great privilege of sitting with an old friend, Marie Paul. I worked with Marie while she was vying for the crown of Miss Hibiscus, and then after while she was vying for the crown of Miss Fiji. Of course, Marie became Miss Suva and was a very popular personality and continues to endure as a very popular face in Fiji's fashion scene. Marie has an interesting identity in that her father is Senegalese and her mother is from Kandavu. Marie speaks to us about that in-between space and what it was like growing up and the woman that she's become today.
You went from being a model to being a contender for Miss Hibiscus, and then you were Miss Suva. What was that like?
That was the biggest boost I've ever had in my self-confidence. It was the first time I believed that I could make a difference. I could be something that I put my mind to. Yeah, so it was the first time that I ever told myself, wow, I can actually be a beauty queen, and I just did my best, and I tried, and it worked. It ended up, I ended up at the top, and still I couldn't believe that I was there. I always had doubt in everything that I ever did, but I guess that self-doubt is also what pushed me. It was a good experience overall.
Your doubt came from the fact that you thought you weren't beautiful?
Yes. Younger, I always saw models, saw pictures of models, and they always had a specific look, a specific skin color.
Describe that.
It was fair skin, very skinny, long blonde hair, colored eyes, and I have none of that. I was a very skinny child, but that
You
was
were skinny and you were tall.
Yes, but that was about it.
So the only thing standing between you and this aspiration that your mother had for you, something that your mother saw in you, was your skin and your hair.
Yes, but I don't think she ever thought that I wasn't good enough to be.
No, she thought that you were. You thought you weren't.
She was the one who always told me, you can be a supermodel. Which reminds me, one day my dad asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And because I always heard it from my mom, you should be a model, you should be a model. I told my dad, I want to be a supermodel. And my dad thought, but why? You'd make more money being a designer. So why don't you try, because I was very artistic too as a young child. I loved art and craft. And so I thought, why don't I be a designer and a model? I have done modeling, but I still have the artistic side. So yeah, I never thought that I could be a model. So I always thought, if I don't become a model, then I will go ahead and try to become a designer.
Do you feel like you had to fight your skin, literally, to overcome and to become that person, to gain that confidence?
It wasn't a battle between me and my skin color, it was more my mindset. Because every time I went for a rehearsal, for a photo shoot, I would get so much praise. And every time there was a photo shoot, I would get picked. And I realized it was because of my skin color, it was because of my hair, it was because of the way I looked, it was because I was so different. And for the first time ever in my life, being different was a good thing. You know, because in school being different was, I would get bullied, I would get teased for the way I looked. But for the first time,
What specifically about the way you looked?
it was how dark my skin was. I was always the darkest, tallest kid in the class, and I had the most frizzy hair. I had the tightest curl definition in my class. Like,
Mhm.
I don't know how to comb my hair, but the Fijian word was manji, rumanji. So I had the mangiest hair and the darkest skin. And that was what I got teased for, and hence the reason why I felt like they were bad things until I started modeling.
So you've been dating the love of your life for some years now. How many years have you and Ben been together?
Almost 5 years.
5
in
years.
November.
5 years. What is that relationship like in figuring out your identity? In somebody, being with somebody who is so strongly and proudly an Itoke man.
It gives me more sense of pride to be half Fijian, because then I get to explore what it truly means to be an Itoke, or the culture that Itoke have been brought up with, and how they take pride in their identity. It helps me to understand myself more, but also me being a half caste, it could be difficult at times to accept traditions and cultures, because I've always grown up with an open mind, and I've always seen people equally, seen people as the same, and culture and tradition was something that helped them or guided them to understand themselves better. And so with him being very, he's a big advocate on Itoke issues, and I think through my experiences with him, I've better understood myself, and I've grown to have a deeper sense of pride for my Itoke side.
That's beautiful.
I've been struggling emotionally since I remember being or realizing that I was different. It was like a battle every day going to school. I would tell myself, okay, another day, what are the kids gonna say? And so after leaving high school, primary school, high school, I still had that sense of, oh, people only accept me when I stand in front of a camera, or when I make clothes look pretty, or when I'm in a photo shoot. But in real life, they don't really think they don't really think that of me.
So you didn't connect the praise and accolade you were getting on the runway in front of the camera as a beauty queen to yourself.
Yes.
So it's like you were two people.
Yes, and yes. Which is why I shied away from the camera. Straight after pageantry, I shied away. I sort of went into hiding, and I told everyone I don't want to model anymore. It's because I felt like people saw me in a different light when I was in front of the camera, and in person, I was a different person. I felt like I was constantly under pressure to be the person that everyone saw on the newspaper, or they saw on TV, which is not who I was. Because when they saw me on TV or on magazines, I was just smiling, I was looking pretty, I was looking happy, but they never actually had a conversation with me to know how I truly feel. So it was like I was wearing a mask. When I was in public with people, I had to put on the happy Marie, pageant queen Marie, model Marie, but I could never be the hurt Marie, or the sad Marie, or the insecure Marie. That's how I felt.
How long did it take you, do you think, to come around that hurt, and to sort of bring together these two parts of who you were? Do you think you've gotten there?
I think I'm almost there, because I've recently gained weight. And so that's also something that I've been complaining about, because I look at my pictures and I see model Marie, and then I look in the mirror and it's like bigger Marie. And so I tell myself, my goodness, you can never be happy. Just be happy with who you are, you know. You've received that validation, being a model, being a pageant queen. You've accepted your skin color. You love to show off your skin color and your hair, but now you're insecure about your weight gain. So I'm almost there. I know I will get there, but I still go through those moments of doubt where I feel like those old voices come back to tell me that, oh, you're actually not worth any sort of success in life.
Do you think that our society in Fiji has a lot to do with people of darker complexions being raised to believe that they are lesser than people of fairer complexions?
Yes, I do. Because when we moved to Fiji when I was younger, and I started primary school, I started class 2. That was the first time I felt like I was aware of my skin color, or I felt aware that I didn't fit in or I looked different. And though I didn't see any wrong with it, I tried to be like the other kids so that I could fit in, so that I could play with them, because I would notice kids start to move away from me after they became aware of how different I looked and how different I was. So yes, I do believe that society's perspective or views on beauty had caused me to be aware of my dark skin.
So, what is it that you see the future of the face of Fiji being? How do you think we're going to navigate this period in our history? How will we all one day feel like we belong?
I think through time and through more conversations like these, we'll one day come to accept that Fiji's always been a multicultural country. And there will always be different faces to a Fijian. Although it's important to preserve our culture and to know what Fiji was in the past, it's also important to know that the world is constantly changing and there will always be new faces added to what a Fijian looks like or what it means to be a Fijian, and not just our traditional views on the boxes that we put ourselves into.
So, last question. Do you feel like you belong?
I do more now than I did in the past. And what contributed to that was my self-acceptance. In accepting that I was different, in accepting that I am African as well as Fijian. And learning more about my Fijian identity and embracing what I can or what I know of my African identity. I feel like I belong more now.
I lied. That wasn't the last question. Do you feel like working in fashion, do you feel like that has contributed to your acceptance of yourself and acceptance of other people around you?
Absolutely, yes. Because, like I said before, that was the first time ever where I felt like, wow, being different is actually a good thing. And so it was the first time I felt confidence or feeling confident in my skin. Being happy that I didn't look like the other girls. And so working in fashion has definitely contributed to my self-acceptance. And it still contributes to that. With me coming back into modeling, it has contributed even more to my self-happiness to this day.
Thank you, Marie, for sharing your story with us. I am deeply inspired. Coming up after the break, we speak to Simran Ali. I recently met Simran through a common friend. Now I get to speak to her about what identity means to her. The aspiring doctor has a lot to say.
So, Simran, what does belonging mean to you?
Wow, I think no one's ever asked me that. I think belonging means that you fit in somewhere. I could define the opposite. It's somewhere where you don't feel out of place. And it's somewhere where you feel welcome, loved, a place where you won't be told that you don't belong or that you need to go back somewhere else.
In your experience as a young Fijian woman, have you always felt like you belonged?
No. There have been times, I think, especially during times of political tension, where I feel like I don't belong, or where I see jokes or remarks being passed around, and I feel like, would that apply to me?
When did you develop an awareness of your ethnic identity and how it related to the way you looked?
I can't say exactly when, but I think it starts off very young because you're already being expected to tick boxes like, oh, I'm Itauke, or I'm Indo-Fijian, or I'm other. So I think it starts with simple things like school applications, going to the doctors for a visit, applying for a bank account, or any documentation transaction that you need to do. You need to tick some box about where you belong. And so that's when I began to put my finger on, okay, this is my ethnicity, and this is the box that I tick because this is who I've been told that I am.
You essentially are an Indo-Fijian woman, but you are of a mixed race background.
Yes.
What does that look like for you in life and in terms of the situation of belonging in a place like Fiji?
Right. So it's always been very easy to tick off being Indo-Fijian, or people saying that, oh yeah, she's Indo-Fijian. But what a lot of people don't know, like I mentioned, that my maternal grandmother and my maternal side is Itauke. They're half. And so I think that, and I've always had that added benefit of being able to speak in both Fijian and Hindi. And so I think that's heavily influenced the way that I classify myself. And I don't think that Indo-Fijian would be the right term for it. So I'd rather say that I'm part Indian, part Fijian. But there's no box for that. So really, what do I say? And so I think that I haven't always belonged to one group of people, and so I have found it both extremely easy and sometimes extremely difficult to belong in either group. So while I can move around in different circles or different friend groups, and as you start out in primary school, they say birds of a feather flock together, so generally sometimes people will be more inclined to stick with the same sort of people when they go to a new place. But I've always found it easy to move in different groups, and I think that was something that was very beneficial for me. And I think just small things like that, and having just a wider understanding and a deeper knowledge of all the different parts that make me who I am, and not neglecting one or the other.
Being able, so the Indo-Fijian identity is it's a unique identity in the world, as we sort of briefly discussed before we started the interview. Being a participant of the identity, but also being an observer, like you just described. How do you feel the Indo-Fijian identity fits into the fabric of Fiji, and then more broadly the world?
Yeah, so I think that how does the Indo-Fijian identity fit into Fiji? I think that Fiji has tried to come a long way in embracing and including Indo-Fijians into the fabric of their identity, because essentially once the Girmitias, or the descendants of indentured laborers, came to Fiji, they became isolated from their connections back in India. And I think it's unfair to say to these people that you don't belong here and that you need to go back to India, because a lot of us don't have anybody left there. We came and we were completely separated. I mean, there was no provision given for people to return. Some people were allowed to, some people were able to, but not everyone was. And so that's how life started here. And so for generations after that have come, this is the only life they've known. And I think that Fiji as a whole needs to embrace and needs to realize that we need to recognize that this is a group of people, and although they weren't the first people of this land or this place, that they were brought here and essentially planted here and grew here. And as for how we fit into the rest of the world, I think when we go anywhere else, it's where you're from. Fiji is home, and that's the identity, and that's what people remember. There's really yes, I'm Indian, yes, I'm Indo-Fijian, but are you from India? No, you're not. No, a lot of people can't say. A lot of people can't say that they are. So I think it's unfair to say that they're not, that Indo-Fijian, they're not from Fiji.
What is your sort of response to claims of racism in Fiji? Do you think racism exists?
Yes. I do think it exists, and I do think it exists in Fiji. And I think that although we might not experience it as loudly and as in your face as most people may have seen before, it is there still. It's hidden in remarks, it's hidden in comments, it's hidden in the inclusion and exclusion of certain people of ethnic backgrounds and different things. And I do think it exists, very similar to microaggressions. I think if you have micro-racism, if that's a term, that it does exist.
Have you been any racist remarks?
I have. And although, thick skin, so you don't take it very seriously, I do take it seriously enough to recognize, like, oh wait, but this is a problem, and this exists, and it is there.
Do you find that it affects your sense of identity?
Not mine, no. But it does enlighten me about what people think and how the mindset either has changed or has not progressed, and how people are feeling and how they're seeing the situations and events unfolding in front of them in regards to ethnicity and about belonging of people.
Now we're going to change tangent just a little bit, but I want to speak to you as a young woman. Well, we're going to start rounding up now. But tell me, now, being who you are ethnically and being who you are by gender as a woman, put the two of those things together. What is your hope for somebody like you?
So just to give a bit of context to what I'm going to say is, I played hockey growing up as a teenager, and I enjoyed it. It was something that I enjoyed very much, and I did a lot of volunteer work, and I was active in a lot of NGO marches, thanks to Fiji Women's Crisis Center with my aunt. And there was definitely a lack of young Indo-Fijian women participating, and I think the emphasis is not placed there on a lot of things like sport and extracurricular activities, activism, design and fashion. I'm not sure how the representation might be, but I think it might be quite similar. And my hope for young Indo-Fijian women is to see more young Indo-Fijian women pursuing these type of activities, coming out of stereotypes like staying at home, getting married, having children, shutting off from the world. I hope to see a lot more of them involved in sports, in other non-academic activities, because those also build you as a person. They allow you to be exposed to a number of things, and I feel like there's a bit more pressure in the Indo-Fijian society to be high achievers all the time. So things that are extracurricular might be frowned upon, or taking up subjects such as music or dance or fashion or sport might be frowned upon. So if you're not being the best that you can be in your field, it's not good. But I really do hope to see a lot more representation in the future, and I think that they can definitely bring a diverse tone to things.
Thank you, Simran. We look forward now to our closing segment where we get to speak to Mara Nailatikau. Mara Nailatikau is a very well-known face in Fiji. She epitomizes grace, intelligence, and beauty. I get to sit down with Mara next to talk about what identity and belonging means to her. So we're going to jump straight into it.
Mm-hmm.
Have you always felt like you belong?
I'd say the answer is definitely no. I think belonging is like, as we've been talking about, is like existing on a set of fault lines. There are always two or even more sides to belonging. And my honest answer to your question is no, I haven't always felt like I belonged. I think one of my earliest perspectives on belonging started as a child because my family moved around quite a bit. And I think this is something that a lot of people are familiar with. You know, we moved around throughout the Pacific before returning to Fiji. And so my parents were medical missionaries and traveled a lot throughout the region. There's Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, but we spent a lot of time in particular in the PNG Highlands. And so I grew up in the middle of the highlands in the Enga province in PNG before coming back to Fiji. And I remember feeling the instant transition of what it meant to be in Fiji and to be Fijian. I remember being very young at the time, but being able to grasp that we had been away for some time and that we were back home. And I think one of the first things that I had to grasp was all the rituals, all the forms of politeness. You have to say chilo, you have to say excuse me before you leave the table, which is common across many cultures, not just Fijians, but just the ways that you need to comport yourself in terms of how you deal with elders, how you deal with others. And I remember that being really interesting, but also quite traumatizing, because you can be reminders of how to act and how to behave can be quite sharp. When you're a kid who's used to running around in the bush and being introduced to Suva at a young age.
How old were you?
I think I was 6 when we came back. I had just started primary school when we arrived in Fiji, but I do remember feeling at times paralyzed, like, am I going to say the right thing? Or am I going to do the wrong thing again? And I think belonging can be quite stressful in that way, having to negotiate your belonging in a certain space. Being able to speak in a language is an incredibly valuable form of currency. Your ability to connect emotionally with someone is really, hangs mostly on your ability to speak the same language. And then, on so many other aspects of how you're able to interact and communicate with each other. So I certainly feel like it holds me back in some ways, but I feel like I make up for it in other ways as well. I think that belonging is so much bigger than my own personal experience. So I have to be comfortable with things that exist outside of my grasp at the moment. And I just prefer to sit with that discomfort. I think, yes, looking back, there would have been so many ways that I would have liked to have developed a better and stronger grasp of my language. I remember talking about this with an uncle, and he was definitely one of those rare and much welcomed, encouraging voices who was always saying, "You always have time to try." He'd always say, "Read the Bible in Fijian," or always make the extra effort to learn. And the point is, you make incremental improvements along the way. But I do have, I do experience setbacks in terms of how I'm able to assert myself or how I'm able to get my message across. I use humor a lot in terms of being able to overcome those barriers. But as I said, I make up for it in other ways. I'm, incredibly more militant now about my identity as an Indigenous person than I ever was. And I think that has been influenced not just by my childhood, but also by having lived abroad for a number of years while I was studying in Europe. And I think it's an incredible privilege to be able to do so. And I know that I'm privileged to have had that experience. And there is something so specific, so situating about being the only person from your country living in a certain place or living in a certain country, for example, especially in a place where they might not speak any of the languages that you're familiar with, which in my case was English. I lived in a non-English speaking country. I lived in Spain for a few years. And I remember that experience as being so crystallizing for me in terms of, looking at myself in the mirror some days and thinking, I am the only Fijian, most likely, in this entire city. And people being so curious about the way that you talk or the way that you look and wondering, what life in Fiji is like. I think those types of experiences for me have really brought me home to myself, in terms of being comfortable with being exactly who you are, exactly where you are, no matter how far away from home you are.
Well, speaking of being the only Fijian, you were in fact the first Melanesian Miss Pacific Islands, and of course, therefore, by extension, the first Fijian Miss Pacific Islands. What was that experience for you like? Do you believe that there is an issue with color in the Pacific?
I'd say there most definitely is. To answer your question about color in the Pacific first, because I can say that I definitely grew up in a family where there were, we were socialized to, and there were definitely statements made about that had colorism at their core. Stay inside, don't play outside for too long, you'll get dark, or all these other aspects of color. And I think that many Fijians would be familiar with these, with these different ways in which we're socialized. I think I was very lucky to have a proudly dark-skinned father, who just, who was very vocal about being proud to be the color that he was. So I think, that's been something that, while over the years, you definitely kind of roll your eyes and you're exasperated at your parents saying the things they say. The older I get as a woman and as an Indigenous woman, I feel really lucky to have had a dad who was very comfortable with looking the way he did and with being the color that he was. And so I think for me that was one of the very grounding things about being comfortable with being a range of colors. So I would say that yes, there definitely is an aspect with colorism in the Pacific, whether it's within the Indigenous Fijian community or across communities in the Pacific. I think participating in the Miss South Pacific pageant was definitely an eye-opener and brought me much closer to experiences where you do realize that people do hold very deeply held beliefs about what is beautiful, what is attractive, what stands for beauty in the region. And there can be very rigid ideas of what those are. And those are usually, those templates for beauty are usually a lot more along the lines of lighter skin, having straighter or wavy hair. I also remember people asking me if I had Polynesian blood, for example, because it seemed to be the only way that they could compute that a Fijian had been crowned Miss South Pacific. So you would get a lot of, innocent-seeming questions, but people can't quite accept the fact that an Indigenous Fijian might be Miss South Pacific. I'd always get questions like, do you have a little bit of Samoan or Tongan or something in you? But it's interesting, Fuzz, because I think the only way that I've been able to survive these types of experiences is to constantly remind myself that people aren't always being malicious. We are the product of our upbringings, of the different ways that society has bombarded us with messages about what's beautiful and what's acceptable. And I always try to keep that in mind when I'm confronted with statements or with people's different ideas about what's beautiful. And looking back now, the pageant was more than a decade ago.
Was it really that long?
It was ages ago. It was forever ago. And being the age that I am now, there are things that I experienced as a child, really, in my early 20s or mid 20s, as I was at the time. And I just think, gosh, the me now would never have, would never have accepted some, an experience like that. But I'm glad that I had, the sense of humor that I did at the time, but also just the unwillingness to absorb any of it. I just kind of said, that's what somebody thinks, and what they think is the product of the world that they've been brought up in, and the way that they've been molded. And I can choose not to let that affect me. Is it hurtful? Is it disturbing? Absolutely. I think going into the Miss South Pacific pageant, there was definitely a lot of hype around the fact that a Fijian had never won the Miss South Pacific pageant before. I had definitely heard stories about how previous Miss Fijis had been treated at these Pacific pageants, and these were experiences that that make you sad when you hear about them. And so I think I definitely went into it really with a chip on my shoulder, really, because I think that I wanted to win it not just for myself, but also I really saw it as a way to win for the diversity of beauty that Fiji represents. Something that I really, really rebel against is the idea that there are certain ways to be Fijian. The older I get, the more allergic I get to the word should. You should do this, and you should wear your hair like this, and you should behave like this. I think that, central to the idea of being a Fijian is belonging. I think we live in such a unique, accidental cauldron of such different identities. So different, and then at the same time so connected. And I think there are ways that we're connected that we don't often value. I think beauty, people's ideas of beauty, can be something that's also quite polarizing, and can cause divisions if we're not careful. But I say live and let live. The reason I rebel against ideas of what should make a good Fijian have to do with my own experiences as well, about being policed is too hard a word, but of having to live up to those expectations as well. I remember getting ready for the South Pacific pageant, and all I could think of was just how I survived this next pageant so I can get back to life as normal and finish uni. And I remember, I think it was a relative who I hadn't heard from in ages, who got in touch with a parent of mine to say, we think Mero Alesi should change her hair. She needs to wear her hair like this if she's going to represent Fiji as Miss Fiji. And I just remember thinking, what? Why would this person think that I have to change this about my hair? But it's absolutely right. Hair is a big part of identity and the way that people express their identity. But I think that that's something that should come from someone's internal sense of belonging, not from anyone else's external sense of policing.
You choose to wear your hair is
exactly
your identity.
Exactly. It's how I choose to express myself, and not a standard that I place on other people in terms of how they should express themselves. And I remember at that time putting my foot down and saying, this is the way I've always worn my hair. Why would I change my hair overnight just so I could do, just so that I can do a pageant? When I know that this is going to be over in a few months' time, and I'm gonna go back to life as normal.
We're a country of multiple looks, multiple ethnicities, multiple hair textures and skin tones and facial features and body structures, and we have multiple ways of understanding what is beautiful, what is aesthetically pleasing, what is Fijian. What is your message to those who feel like maybe they don't belong?
I'd say that if you don't belong, or if you feel like you don't belong, then I'd say never feel bad about creating space for yourself. Never feel bad about speaking up for yourself. I think that if people are feeling frustrated or disengaged, the worst symptom is silence, because almost nothing gets resolved with silence. It means that people have given up hope in a way. But if people are expressing their annoyance or expressing some sort of hope that they might be able to see themselves, then I think that that's always going to be a good thing. And something that I like to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about beauty or what it means, or anything in life really, is to say yes and instead of yes but. I think I said that. I think that came out wrong. But if something is beautiful, you can say yes, that's beautiful, and so is this. It's about opening the door wider instead of saying that's not beautiful, this is beautiful instead. I think that doesn't do anyone any justice. What you can do is, you can elevate beauty without having to push other forms of beauty down. And that's something that gets lost too much. And I think that most of it is really just a symptom of people feeling excluded for so long, and people's hurt and people's frustration comes out in anger. And I think what we need to do is realize that yes, you can elevate your own beauty without having to diminish anyone else's. It's a tough thing to do, especially if the world has already been, if there have been these giant commercial structures and these big societal structures, these norms that have told us that a particular form of beauty is desirable, is aspirational. There are entire beauty industries that are built on this, hair industries even that are built on this. It's why it's probably easier to find a hair straightening cream here than it is to find a decent moisturizer for natural hair. It's almost like that wicked curse. Healthy food can be more expensive sometimes than a burger. But I think that speaks a lot to a broader structural societal issue. And I think that really, just to answer your question, if somebody feels like they don't belong, that I hope they never feel bad about speaking up for themselves. And for those of us who do feel like we belong, sometimes, who have the privilege of being able to have carved out a sense of belonging for ourselves, we also owe it to people who feel like they, who don't feel like they belong, to help create space for them as well. And sometimes that might mean giving them space. Sometimes it might mean speaking up for them and then supporting them to speak up for themselves. And I think that we're just robbing ourselves of the absolute joy of seeing beauty everywhere. And I'm sure you know this too. There'll be days when you're in the car and you just see someone cross the road and you're like, that man, it's beautiful. Just from the, something, the way that they might dress or the way they carry themselves or the way that they're wearing their hair. I think that there's a beautiful existence to be had when you have a much broader sense of beauty. And when you can see beauty in unexpected places, especially in our own country, and in the diversity of ways that people express their individuality. I think that that's such a better way to exist than to think that we only find it in these little squares on coffee tables. It's everywhere around us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Faz.
Thank you, Mara, and all my other guests for being a part of this incredible episode. Identity and belonging are two very important and complex issues, but figuring them out is an important part of living a stylish life. Coming up over the next 2 weeks, we look back on some of our favorite moments over the last 20 episodes of the season. Soon after that, we'll be bringing you fresh stories about beauty, about life, and about living as stylishly as you possibly can. Until then, take care of each other and be kind.